At the World Government Summit in Dubai, former Fox News host Tucker Carlson continued to draw on his interview with Russian President Vladimir Putin and even praised the way things are in Moscow. Take a look.
Simply the leader of the country, who of course is impressive. It's the largest landmass in the world. And it's wildly diverse, linguistically, culturally, religiously. It's hard to run a country like that for 24 years, whether you like it or not. So an incapable person couldn't do that. He is very capable, and many of you know him, and you know that. What was radicalizing, very shocking, and very disturbing for me was the city of Moscow, where I'd never been, the biggest city in Europe, 13 million people. And it is so much nicer than any city in my country. I had no idea. My father spent a lot of time there in the 80s when he worked for the U.S. government and barely had electricity. And now it is so much cleaner and safer and prettier aesthetically. Its architecture, its food, its service, than any country, city in the United States that you have to, and this is non-ideological. How did that happen? How did that happen? And at a certain point, I don't think the average person cares as much about abstractions as about the concrete reality of his life. And if you can't use your subway, for example, as many people are afraid to in New York City because it's too dangerous.
Look, we should just have communism, and then we can have nice things. I'm kidding, obviously, but there's like many layers to why this is really bizarre.
Well, go ahead, sorry.
What is this? Have you traveled? I mean, are you surprised by the fact that there are places that aren't America that are beautiful and lovely and clean? All these years when you've been saying America is the greatest country in the world, was it a statement based in ignorance as to having not traveled? There are many ways that America is great compared to other countries and is beautiful, and I think does have beautiful cities with beautiful architecture. But given that America is such a young country, you can go almost anywhere else and find architecture that is older, equally or more beautiful, and vastly more interesting. Moreover, there is a political angle to this, where there are countries, many in Europe, that have invested more in their infrastructure and their social welfare state and their trash pickup and giving baby boxes to mothers and sending them home with care and health care and all of these other kinds of things that make the standard of living better in those places and make the aesthetics of the place better. You have to invest in public infrastructure. That is, I'm sorry, big government. And the last aspect of this is the kind of, I don't know, I guess the naivete that I keep coming back to. Is he really that surprised that he could go someplace else in the world and see clean streets? Oh no, the other point I wanted to make was there is a kind of, and Liz Wolfe, I actually saw making this point on Twitter, that some countries you go to that are clean in a way that kind of defies our expectations in America, like how could you prevent someone from ever throwing gum on the ground? Or, well, you do that through authoritarianism.
Right.
And is what you're saying then that you want to have Singapore-level punishments, right, as someone who, again, says they're about freedom and who you don't want people to be walking around like automatons, is the trade-off that you're willing to make for a city that doesn't have a single plastic cup on the ground, gulags that you're thrown into if you transgress.
Right. Yeah, I think there are a number of criticisms one can make of, you know, the direction of Tucker's comments there, while still acknowledging that it's a very old city with a lot of beautiful architecture and a lot of rich history. America is a newer place. A lot of our buildings were built during like the brutalism phase of architecture, which is just horrible. A lot of the buildings in DC are really ugly. Some of the architecture in DC is quite beautiful.
It's lovely, yeah.
Our Capitol is a beautiful building, and so on and so forth. And then the standard of living, you know, kind of depends on what you're talking. The standard of living is in a lot of American cities, you know, higher for most people than in Moscow. Now, Tucker might have been taken through the nice parts of this, you know, he's on a tour, sure, officially by the government. He's seeing how the nicest and most well-off people live. It is not really an apples to oranges comparison. And then the point about, you know, needing, right, they can use authoritarianism there to keep everything very clean in a way that we cannot. I mean, look, I was struck by this too when I traveled to Italy in the fall on a just vacation, and I was in Rome, and you know, some of the city isn't as nice and has a lot of graffiti, but the metro system was extremely clean, was much cleaner than what I'm accustomed to here in DC, and significantly more clean than what I'm accustomed to in New York. And that was broadly true of the places I traveled to in the country, not all of them. Naples has seen better days. But so I was similarly having that view. Of course, there's more economic opportunity here, and it's a younger country, and people want to live here, and it's it's not always fair comparisons. But I see where he was going at. But I think you can take this thinking too far and say that we should have Singapore-style policies, which no one in America would be willing to put up with.
Also, I will say there are cultural ways to get people to invest in your city. I don't think Japan is clean because of authoritarianism. I think Japanese school children are asked, they clean their own schools, they bust their own trays, they clean their own dishes, they get mops and brushes and clean their own classrooms. And you can instill those kinds of values if you want to in a community to take care of a community as a shared good. But when I start saying things like shared goods and commons and public works, we're getting into a zone of politics that I think that maybe Tucker isn't so comfortable with. I would love a world where we celebrated our public works and we championed our subway system and we all adopted our neighborhood subway system and we all were compelled, asked, whatever, to participate in keeping our communities clean. But there's a lot of research that shows that, for example, when you have projects where people know they don't own the building, they don't own their property, they are much more likely to not take care of it, to not care what happens to it, versus if you have different kinds of building structures where people are allotted their own yards and told this is your garden, you can do what you want. It really has an effect on human behavior if they think there's
the common. So it's an argument for more
private
control of spaces.
Projects are not private control of spaces, but it's allowing people to use the public spaces. I also saw a really interesting, it was actually a TikTok, but by someone who's like a foraging expert. And she was going through the history of how it came to be that people don't realize that they can pick fruit. There was a viral TikTok of a girl that said, I didn't realize I could eat the fruit off the lemon tree in the backyard. And everyone was dragging her for obvious reasons. How do you not know that you can eat the lemon off the tree in the backyard? But there's also this long history of only populating female or male trees when we plant trees on the roads if they're fruit-bearing trees, because they didn't want there to be fruits growing on the tree that could be for public consumption. That there were all of these laws that were passed in the South after the Civil War.
That's why we have allergies too.
It is. Yeah. But to prevent slaves from being able to harvest food off of lands that used to be plantations, as they were allowed to do when they were slaves, but then the landowners got passive aggressive after the end of slavery and said no more. And so you can't use the stuff on public parks because as public parks aren't allowed to forage. You can't use the stuff that's private land. And people forget how to use the resources that are growing out of the ground and should be publicly available for all. So there's a lot to get into there. But for me, the big takeaway is, have you been anywhere before, Tucker, with all of your millions and all of your opportunities? This is the first time you're out of the country seeing what the rest of the world has to offer. Meanwhile, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance appeared on Tucker Carlson's show weighing in on the $60 million Ukraine aid package that has been proposed in Congress, a package Vance is trying to kill. Here he is on the legislation.
Everyone knows that this war will lead to the destruction of Ukraine. I've had conversations with Democratic colleagues where they get this sort of dark look in their eyes and they say effectively that they want to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian drop of blood. I think if you really ask these guys, they recognize that this is not in the best interest of Ukraine. This is fundamentally in the interests of military contractors and people who think that America's most pressing challenge is to defeat the Russians. Of course, that's not a preoccupation that I share.
Some more commentary on this aid package, which we've discussed a lot today. People should check out our several other segments we did on the funding for Israel and for Ukraine. But yes, I think it's very valid to ask questions about what we are doing here. What is the strategy? What is the strategy given how many, again, military experts. I know people are rightly distrustful of military experts, given how they always say we should do these kinds of things. They recommend them. But even the military experts are privately and now somewhat publicly conceding that this is not an effort that is going to succeed, and we need a path toward peace, and we need to start making that happen.
Yeah, that's right.
More Rising right after this.